by the military. We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex.
And then play the next one. That was in 1961. This is in there on the
shadowy government with its own Air Force, its own Navy, its own fundraising mechanism.
There you go.
And the ability to pursue its own ideas of the national interest, free from all checks and balances, and free from the law itself.
That's a U.S. senator saying that, not a conspiracy theorist at a UFO conference. So, and then I want to play the next one, which is, put up the next quote from Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter, the first director of the CIA.
It is time for the truth to be brought out. Behind the scenes, high-ranking Air Force officers are soberly concerned about the UFOs. But through official secrecy and ridicule, many citizens are led to believe the unknown flying objects are nonsense. I urge immediate congressional action to reduce the dangers from secrecy about unidentified flying objects. CIA Director, Vice Admiral Roscoe Hillenkoetter.
Make note, that was the first CIA director at the time of Roswell. The CIA was formed within weeks of the Roswell event. He, in a letter to Congress that was later printed in the New York Times, called for this congressional oversight, and he did not talk about the dangers of the UFOs. He talked about the dangers of the secrecy around UFOs, just like Eisenhower did. It's a nuance with a huge distinction. So, on the one hand, we had interstellar civilizations surveilling our most sensitive atomic weapons facilities, and we were taking actions to down them and destroy them. And there have been hundreds of these objects that have been downed, not a couple, hundreds. In fact, there's a man on my team who was at Fort Huachuca, which is Army Intelligence Headquarters, ironically out near Tombstone, Arizona, where they had in an underground facility that he worked in, where there were 9 separate ET craft of different types from different civilizations that had been downed, some of them in Mexico and then brought back up across the border. And in the morgue were just, dozens and dozens of ET bodies that were recovered and had been studied and in storage. So this is not something that's a everyday occurrence, but it isn't that rare, but it's incredibly dangerous. Because after I began briefing people like the director of the CIA and presidents and Minister of Defense heads in other countries and members of the Senate Intelligence Committee and generals and admirals at the Pentagon, I learned that the nature of these unacknowledged special access projects were that they were keeping most of those guys in the dark about what they were doing. And this is the most shocking thing of all, and this is why Eisenhower said, beware the military-industrial complex. It will become a threat to our way of life. The secrecy, excessive secrecy, will undermine our democracy. And actually, at the time he said that, that was his last farewell address to the nation, to America, as he left office in January of 1961. It had already happened. He wasn't saying this might happen. It had already happened. Because between the 1945 time period and 1960, there essentially had been a massive coup d'etat by very cleverly moving all these technologies and all these operations in a program that are unacknowledged and beyond the reach of the US president, and even if the president knows about it, beyond the control of it. An Air Force officer I met with who flew with John F. Kennedy on Air Force One told me, and I have a tape recording of this interview, it's very interesting. Back in the 90s when I interviewed him, he said, the president brought this issue up, and he said to me that he knew about it, and he had been briefed on the extraterrestrial matter. But he said, and I'm quoting, the whole matter is out of my hands, and I don't know why. Now, this is the President of the United States. And this should scare the hell out of everybody. And I'll tell you why. Because we live in a world, it's sort of like the Truman Show. You remember that movie with Jim Carrey where, he finally realizes he's on a set and it's all fake? We live in this world of sort of make-believe, and I call it make-believe politics, make-believe media news, make-believe science, make-believe history. It's all make-believe. And the truth is never spoken about, and very rarely. And when you do speak the truth, you're going to be attacked and pilloried, as I have been, and I'm sure others of you who've spoken out in your communities may have been. But the reason the secrecy has been enforced and created in this unacknowledged special access project, the mechanism of the secrecy, we're not talking about normal top secret TSSCI, top secret special compartmented information or intelligence. We're talking about a level of secrecy where if you had an organizational chart, you would have the President of the United States at about level 21. In fact, I've seen this chart. This is at about level 43, 44. So, and never mind your prime minister. So, no offense. I mean, no offense to any of you. I know, spoken like a real Yankee. And the same is true for our secretaries of defense. Gordon Cooper, who is in our film Unacknowledged in an interview, and many of you have seen this clip. What you have not seen, and what most of you do not know, is that some years ago I was given a presentation, and so was he, to the Federalist Society, a very conservative, old guard constitutionalist organization. And you see it a lot in the media in Washington. And I was in a ballroom larger than this, and it was their annual gathering. And before I spoke, Gordon Cooper came up to me and my wife and said, the Secretary of Defense a couple years ago, who at the time was Cohen, Secretary of Defense Cohen under Clinton, had asked me personally to give him all the specific data of what happened when his crew filmed a UFO landing in broad daylight out on one of the dry lake beds at Edwards Air Force Base, I believe in 1956. And because the Secretary of Defense wanted to see that footage and wanted to get to the bottom of this. And so astronaut Gordon Cooper gave the Secretary of Defense all the granular, actionable intelligence you would need to retrieve that information, and then got back later to Gordon Cooper, and the Secretary of Defense said, I'm denied access, apparently, because that has disappeared into some black hole. Now, this is the Secretary of Defense of the United States. So I tell these stories not because they're just apocryphal or sort of, but it shows a pattern that's very important from a legal point of view. And that is, and this is where I would differ a little bit with my friend, Mr. Hellier. We don't need to rescind the National Security Act. What we need to do is to violate illegal projects that are using the National Security Act illegally. Let me go through that again. Get your mind around this. If an operation is illegal and is lying to the president and to Congress or to your parliament and your prime minister or your minister of defense, because as minister of defense said, he wasn't read into the projects that I know are going on in Canada today and at the time he was MOD head. Those projects are, by definition, off the reservation, and they are running outside the rule of law, and they are unconstitutional. A priori, they cannot cite the rule of law to prosecute anyone who defects from them. Got it? All right, that's how I've gotten all these military guys to speak. And sometimes it takes me 5 years of hand-holding a colonel or someone at the FAA or whoever to get them to actually step forward, name, rank, and serial number. But for every one that you will see in the Disclosure Project archive that we have, and we have several dozen on our YouTube channel, it's youtube.com/sdisclosure, S as in serious, but S, the letter disclosure. We have about 800 more, or more than that that have given me information, documents, what have you, about programs they've been in, but they're terrified to come forward. So what we really need is an executive order that would say you are hereby allowed to speak about these projects since they have been run illegally for 70 years. Now, in the absence of that, and Daniel Sheehan and I discussed this in some length, we, the people, can tell folks that we know, and some of you may know people who've worked in these projects, that they cannot be prosecuted under any national security protocols if they are exposing an operation which is at its core an illegal operation. And I am here to tell you the secrecy on this issue is not only illegal and unconstitutional, but provably so. Because in proof of the pudding is this: I have published and put out top secret documents that were handed off to me by folks in the CIA and NSA that have not been declassified. Why am I not in prison? Yes, because I had an FBI guy threaten me once, and I said, make my day. Put the bracelets on. My first call isn't going to be to a shyster. It's going to be to people I know in the media, and you will have confirmed the legitimacy of the document, and we will contest it, and then we're going to hit former President Bill Clinton with a subpoena. We're going to hit the CIA director I briefed with a subpoena, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency that I met with for hours who had been denied access to these projects, a 3-star general, Patrick Hughes. All of them are going to have to testify under oath that they were given actionable intelligence by my team of current operations at facilities at Nellis Air Force Base, so-called Area 51, at Dugway, the proving grounds out in Utah, the state-of-the-art facility, the area, the Los Alamos connected facilities, Kirkland Air Force Base and Sandia Labs, and on and on and on and on. And they were all denied access. But they were in a commanding position where they had a need to know. Therefore, the projects are illegal. And so this guy looked at me, he says, "Oh, you're crazy." I said, "Yeah, like a fox." Yeah, but I mean, it is a little scary sometimes dealing with these fascists. But when the day is done, they're no worse than gangbangers I had to deal with in the ER. And my Tech 9's coming in your face. I'm going to kill you, you know. Yeah, so I'm saying it's America, you know. This happens every Saturday. So, so it really does. So, a scathing commentary. Should have my own Sirius XM channel. Offend everybody, I guess. But what has happened over the course of these 70 years is that the entrenched powers have become more entrenched. And this has caused us to have be in a time right now where a lot of people ask me, when is official disclosure going to happen? I said, well, we're doing it. And they go, what do you mean? I said, we're doing it. Well, what do you mean? I said, we're in charge of doing it. And they'll say, well, what the fuck do you mean? And I'll say, you don't get it. The people who are inside that cabal who want this out are asking us to do it.
That's why you're not in prison.
Got it? But not just me, you, all of us. It has to be people's disclosure. We have to do it. We have to recruit more people to do it. We need more people to defect. We need more people to get this film in the hands of 1 billion people. We need all of that. It's very grassroots. Because when people have tried to step off the reservation of this secrecy too far, they've ended up like Jack Kennedy. They've ended up like Marilyn Monroe, who was killed because she was going to hold a press conference. And that document is in the new book. I apologize, the books aren't here. Our publisher couldn't get them into Canada. So much for free trade. Anyway, don't get me started on that. GM can move billions of dollars across the border. We can't get it across without red tape like you've never seen. Anyway, so what has happened is that over the course of these last 70 years, There are people who really are on the side of the angels, who are on the inside, but when they have tried to step out because they were made men, it's like a mafia, they were made men inside the system. Whereas I'm nobody. I'm a country doctor who has worked in an ER, taking care of shootings and stabbings and heart attacks and strokes and all the fun stuff. And what ended up really causing me to the light bulb went off is that after I spent 1993 until 1998 briefing the who's who in our government and your government, governments around the world, asking them to do it, I realized, A, they didn't have the courage to do it. B, they didn't have access control. Now, what do I mean by access control? Well, I can brief this lovely lady here about and read her in on a project, and she'll learn about it. And that's what you do with the president. But if she says to me, I want to have control and I want you to do X, Y, and Z with that project, I'll say, no, ma'am, you don't have control over it. We're controlling it. Now, that has happened over and over again to U.S. presidents. One that's in the movie, there was a guy named President Jimmy Carter. Now, he's probably not in a lot of your radar. Many of you weren't alive when he was president in the 70s. However, President Carter, when he was elected, the first thing he did was ask outgoing CIA director, but he was still CIA director, George Bush Sr., to be read into or briefed on this subject. Guess what happened? Bush turned to him and said, I'm not going to tell you anything. If you want to learn something, get it from the Congressional Research Service. See what they can scrounge together for you. And brushed him off. Now, of course, that's illegal. It was a power play. They did not want Jimmy Carter, who ran as one of his campaign promises to end UFO secrecy and open the UFO files, because he had had a sighting of one when he was governor of Georgia. And Carter kept pushing, put together a White House study group. They were going to contract with Stanford Research International, SRI. SRI had some people in the black world approach them from the Pentagon and were threatened with losing all their contracts with the Department of Defense, and they denied to do the project for the U.S. president. That's a true story. Then what happened, he kept pushing, and eventually a couple men came into the private quarters of the White House and said, President Carter, if you would like to complete your first term as president, you will keep your goddamn mouth shut about this issue. Just like that. Now that happened, and we know that happened because I know the Carter people in the Carter family and in the Carter Center. So what you end up with a picture of is you might know about the issue, you may drill down on it, but it doesn't mean that you're going to have control over these operations. So the command and control system that everyone thinks exists on normal things, intercontinental ballistic missiles, blowing up Iraq, that's in place. The stuff Snowden revealed, that was being overseen by the president and the intelligence community. This is not just a normal black project. These are unacknowledged special access projects and personnel. And the way they operate is that if you're not in the compartment, you speak of it to nobody. And if you do, you are assassinated. Now, one of my advisors for many years during this turbulent time, the whole thing's been turbulent, and he said to me, he said, well, I was in one of these projects. It was about a $3 billion unacknowledged special access project. This is one project, $3 billion US dollars. And we were taken into an underground facility. Everyone had their weapons taken. Everyone had their recorders, watches, anything electronic. One guy went down with a sidearm and went down, pulled a bullet out of the chamber and said, if any of you speak about the existence of this project to anyone not in this room, in this SCIF, Secure Communication Intelligence or Information Facility, this bullet will find you and you're a dead man walking. Now, this is a very serious naval commander who I know very well. And I've talked to many other men and women who have been in similar positions. So that is how unacknowledged special access projects operate. It's like the mafia. You blow the whistle on the Don, they're going to whack you. So this is a very nasty sort of way of controlling things. You break the law, you deny access to people who want to get the truth out, you threaten them, you defame them, you engage Disney Studios to make cartoons about the subject, so it's ridiculed. Did you know that we have a document that, in a CIA document, officially released to me after I met with the CIA director, describing in the 50s of the CIA engaging Disney Studios to make cartoons about aliens, you see, so that people would take it with levity, ridicule it, and create a lot of social opprobrium and embarrassment if you were seriously taking UFOs into consideration. So this is what we're going to talk about a great deal at my workshop tomorrow, is the structure of how that has happened and the extent to which the UFO subculture was the primary target, and still is, of the disinformation and counterintelligence operations. It is the number one, because how else are people finding out about this? The internet and the UFO subculture. It's not a pretty story, but you need to know it. Now, I want to go, before too much time passes, to this next slide by the General Douglas MacArthur.
The nations of the world will have to unite, for the next war will be an interplanetary war. The nations of the earth must someday make a common front against attack by people from other planets. General Douglas MacArthur.
That was in 1955.